and thanks for joining this session from your location, wherever you are joining us from. I'm Kathy Carey from the University of Southern Queensland, and I'm based in Toowoomba, Queensland. It's really hard to believe that it's day 3 of the conference, and I really hope that you've enjoyed the sessions you've attended so far. So just before we get started, I know that you're all probably very familiar with the events platform by now, but just remembering if you do have any tech issues during the session that you can contact the live support team for assistance. And during this session, please use the live Q&A tab to ask any questions, and there'll be an opportunity at the end to have your questions answered. So this session is being facilitated by Fiona Bygraves. Fiona has over 20 years experience in the tertiary education sector, primarily as a faculty general manager at Monash University and leader of a diverse team supporting teaching, research and campus operations. In her downtime, Fiona is also the chair of the ATEM Bass Region, an ATEM board member and a passionate advocate for professionals in the sector. She's certainly one busy lady. So welcome, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Kathy, for that warm welcome. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which I speak today and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to specifically acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the land on which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects through our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. My name is Fiona Bygraves and I am the Faculty General Manager for Law at Monash University. Whilst I'm ordinarily located at the Clayton campus in suburban Melbourne, I'm coming to you today from my home office, a place many Melburnians have come to acknowledge over the past 18 months as our main workplace. Look, I'd take my hat off to each and every one of you that has had to adapt your workplace to home since the pandemic commenced, so well done you. Monash University was founded on the belief that the search for knowledge and the ways to use it never end. It's embedded in our motto, Ancora Imparo, I'm still learning. The Monash Law Faculty was established more than half a century ago and is the only Australian law school to operate from seven different locations on 3 continents, and with significant investment in 3 community legal centres. Our commitment to local communities and the local legal profession is as deep as our commitment to preparing our students and supporting our academics to make a difference in the world. We also have our dedicated Monash University Law Chambers situated in the Melbourne Legal District that complements our Clayton base and legal clinics. As Kathy mentioned, I'm the chair of the ATEM Bass region, covering all of Victoria and Tasmania, and proudly lead a team of hardworking volunteers that put together programs to build your professional competence, connect with your colleagues, build new insights and a sense of community within your institution and sector. As an ATEM board member, I'm proud to champion the rights in place for developing professional staff in our sector and for creating opportunities for lifelong learning. I'm a primary school graduate from Deakin University. I have a Master's of Human Resource Management from Swinburne, and I'm a recent graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, arming me with a raft of new skills and knowledge to support the work I undertake on a number of not-for-profit boards I serve. So before we kick off, let's try a quick poll. I don't know if you've had a chance to do one of these yet, but for those of you who need an acronym dictionary to navigate the university sector like me, CIRT stands for Critical Incident Response Team. So here comes my first poll. Let's see how you go. I've just started that first poll. See if you can answer those questions there. Have you ever been involved in a CIRT meeting in the past 2 years? Terrific. So those results are coming through. Thanks for taking the time. That really helps me to understand who I'm talking to today. I'm not sure if you can see the results. Oh, I can share the results. Let me share those with you now. Is everybody seeing those results? Not sure. Let me tell you that 32% of you said yes and 68% of you said no. Right, so here comes another poll question. For those of you who were involved in a CERT meeting in the past 2 years, was that around COVID management? Okay. There's a few more responses coming through. Thank you. Here, I'm just going to click on share the results and see how we go. 58% of you said yes, and 43% said no. Interesting. All right. So, out of the 32% of you that have participated in CERT meetings, just a bit over half of those were around COVID. Here comes your final poll question. If you answered yes, is your COVID CERT team still meeting? So this is only for a small number of you now. We've really narrowed the number of people who can participate. Wow, this is really interesting. I'll just give it another minute or so. 61% of you said, oh no, 57 said, yes, your CERT team is still meeting. Well, that's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I think I don't need to do anything else for that poll now. I think that's all moved on. So, look, I need to preface this with I'm not an expert in crisis management, despite having worked in high risk engineering faculties and working as a lead professional staff member in a circus school for nearly 7 years. So I don't call myself an expert, but I am asking the question, do you think there's anything that can be learned from the current crisis management methodology and the experiences that we've just had? And crisis management is a catchphrase, that is used for a series of activities that are triggered in response to a situation that occurs unexpectedly. In some cases, it's maybe a little bit of a tick box, but over the last 18 months, I have realised our plans and put them into action multiple times as I led our faculty through a number of crisis scenarios. As tertiary education professionals, we're sort of required to wear many hats, and managing crisis in the workplace hasn't been a focus of this scale, where every element of our operations requires action at such short notice. So, what can we learn from this, and how can we prepare in order to respond more effectively and efficiently moving forward? It's a bit of a dry topic, so hang in there and I'll do my best to enable you to have a bit of a takeaway. So, crisis management can include critical incident management, incident recovery, business continuity frameworks, and any variety of the above terms. This presentation is not about critiquing any of the current frameworks my employer has in place, as they have served us very well indeed. My discussion today is about how managers at that local level interact with them and how management responds. And this is management within your local area when critical incidents are long ranging, multiple in a short period of time, or concurrent. Critical incident training in the forming of a CERT team, otherwise known as a critical incident response team, usually focuses on business continuity, although historically they've included actual or threatened losses of life or serious injury or loss of key personnel, actual or threatened denial of access to buildings or loss of buildings, actual or threatened sustained loss of IT, comm system, and core utilities, and that has been a particular focus, or research projects that have been threatened or disrupted. So the training exercises I've undertaken generally focus on that lack of system access as the key feature of an incident. In actual fact, the training exercise that my team and I undertook just 2 months prior to COVID included a building outage and a TB outbreak. And I can't tell you how much we scoffed at the TB outbreak. Little did we know what was ahead. So when an incident strikes, the issue I've found is that you barely have time to check your risk ratings, business impact analysis spreadsheets, templates, or plans. In November 2019, our incident recovery plan was just 15 pages long. By the time it was next reviewed earlier this year, it had grown to 21 pages, and the last version is 26. It's a reflection for me about how much we've learned over the last couple of years and the complexity of risk management as a concept. So the current approach to approaching any incident is really, as I've got here on the slide, understand the situation. Is it centrally managed or locally? Who's equipped to take the lead? Which team will lead, and which information flows are in place? So, speaking of information flow, how does that communication work internally, externally? Who's got the authority to speak on the matter? Who's actually conducting the incident management, and what tools are being used as part of that assessment, as part of the decision making sub-plan and processes? Does the impact require monitoring and mitigation? What are the recovery objectives? How do we determine the timings? What further information is required? And to me, this is the guts and the workroom of the matter. And then there's the strategy and plan action, usually a high level management activity and not so relevant for those local level matters that I'm going to refer to. And then how do you transition to that recovery phase? So let's bring a bit of reality into this discussion. How did this work when you are managing multiple and concurrent crises of different complexity and depths? Because my talk is around that megatrend issue. So let me paint you a picture. In January 2020, COVID was a word we were just beginning to hear about. However, before our first COVID CERT team formed, I led the faculty through 3 other search team formations. Yes, 3 in 1 month alone. How can you possibly have 4 cert team meetings in less than 1 month? Well, I have to tell you, we got pretty good at them, and I became intimately familiar with the frameworks, the requirements, and the documentation. The first CERT team was formed in the first and second week of January to discuss our response to the terrible bushfires that ravaged the eastern seaboard of Australia for months. The most immediate needs were discussed. How could we support and respond within our community and provide meaningful support to all our stakeholders, including the legal fraternity? While it was not as impactful as CERT meetings to come, there was still a sense of urgency and, of course, the lingering smoke in the air to remind us of our focus and care. It had seemed we'd barely drawn breath, and the air was still full of smoke haze, and we were about to have a week of soaring temperatures, and our city chambers facility had a complete air conditioning malfunction. We were advised that we could keep the building cool for 1 more day, then it would be untenable to host classes there for over 600 students in our seminar rooms. So our second CERT team formed. The team wasn't much bigger than the first. The impact was far more significant, and quick thinking and action was required. Out came the templates, the butcher's paper in lieu of a whiteboard, and collective minds working together to problem solve what to do. Some classes were postponed, others moved to another facility, or pretty quickly. I have to say that this facility that we're talking about isn't on a university's campus as such, so it is a facility managed by the local area. So what did we need? Who did we need to consult with internally was sort of an issue because it wasn't on the university campus as such. And how quickly could we get in touch with our student body? We needed to identify the staff impacted, permanent and sessional staff, and then we had teams of people on the phone to communicate which classes were continuing, which were paused, and which classes were in the pipeline. The air conditioning wasn't quite fixed before the impact of COVID started to impact university operations. Central crisis meetings kicked off, and then it just seemed like we're in the middle of a perfect storm of CERT meetings. Picture this. My dean and I attend a central COVID meeting. We return to the faculty and proceed to gather the relevant parties for the final close-off CERT meeting for the air conditioning issue at our city chambers. Some in the room leave. There's effectively a small baton change, excuse me. We move into a newly formed CERT team to manage our offshore operations. A brief break, and then we're off again with another newly formed CERT team to manage our Melbourne-based CERT response. Here was our perfect storm. Can you imagine the butcher's paper that we went through? This is what felt like the kickstart to what I call our megatrend, crisis on top of crisis, all requiring a unique approach, individual management, careful communication, diligent record keeping, at local and central levels, and a constant supply of energy. It was a frantic few weeks, compounded by the fact that all the training we had undertaken only a few months ago didn't really prepare us to face multiple simultaneous CERT meetings. And yet it was going to get so much worse. Building closures, COVID cases amongst our community, going into lockdown, phasing back to work, masks on, masks off, classes on, classes off, vaccinations open, COVID testing clinics open, interstate borders closed, interstate borders reopened, reactivation, and well, you know that cycle goes on and on. The rules kept changing. The press conferences required interpretation, and then new legislation passed before the university could form a formal position on how we were going to interpret some of the new rules before we could activate our plans. And it seemed like a never-ending cycle. So we needed to think about our co-tenants in some of our buildings, where our students were placed in organisations out of our control, our multiple sites, our students studying under the trimester model as well as a semester model, And which of our current students were offshore on university approved travel? Where were all of our staff travelling overseas? We had students in the UK competing in mooting competitions, and who had travel booked that was about to leave the country. So I'm sure for many of you, this is exactly what you went through. So I'm not giving you anything that's groundbreaking yet, but I do ask you, at what point do you abandon the CERT framework and move into that BAU? I'm not sure we've got that right just yet either. So, what do I propose moving forward? I propose that we need a slightly more practical and embedded crisis management response structure. And that's not to abandon what we've already got, but this is just to help provide focus at that local level when you're hit with this perfect storm, to provide an increase in just two areas: accountability and communication, so that it becomes an automatic and far more responsive process. And that's not to ignore the other elements of any response, but to give rise to these two areas so that any crisis that you're facing, if it becomes a mega trend of many on at the same time or one straight after the other, that it is manageable. The value of the different CERT teams for every incident was the value of the diverse views and the need to include some portfolio leads in discussions and not others. We didn't want to unnecessarily waste the time of those who didn't necessarily need to be in the room versus those who genuinely did, who needed to be at the table versus those who just needed to be informed of the decision. So here's my ideal approach to complex multiple crises as follows, taking into account, I guess, some of the mistakes that we learnt along the way. That first issue around understanding the situation, is it centrally managed or locally, and who's equipped to take the lead? Which team will take the lead, and are information flows in place? So we probably needed to ask the team who else needed to be in the room, and some of our feedback after our CERT meetings had finished was our ability to stick to the agenda and not get sidetracked by other issues was a little bit confusing. And later meetings did include too many people, which meant as they left the room, they had to work out, well, who was actually responsible for what. So there was a lot to be learnt from that immediate understanding where we are. A strong focus on communications, I would recommend, both internally and externally, and who's got the authority to speak on those matters. And we had to think about how we were going to communicate with our accrediting body around changes to assessment, students transitioning to learning from home, and all of the timing of that communication and flow was really critical, and then how we managed internal and external communications at the same time. The conduct and the assessment of any sort of crisis, I think the tools that we had to be able to undertake that worked really well, and I wouldn't recommend any major changes there. When it came to the decision making and the subplans and processes, working out, does the impact require monitoring and mitigation, and what are the recovery objectives, was really critical. Determining those timings and what further information was required. This sort of felt like the guts of the workroom of the matter, and this is where I felt we spent the most time and it was most valuable. But I do think we could have done more. As our issues gave us little planning or prep time, I guess none of them ever really do. So this is a step that does need more attention. And again, going back to that authority point, who had the authority to make the decisions? And let's be open and honest about it, and call it out up front. We think we have clear delegations in the university around who can sign a form, who can spend some money, but I don't know that we were always as clear about that CERT matter. And we've got great frameworks for it, but I think when the rubber hit the road, there was some uncertainty there. This strategy and planning, number 6 on this slide, was probably not so relevant for local matters, and it's more probably relevant when an issue is managed at that higher level. So, in that transition to recovery phase, what signals do you need to move into BAU? And I feel like we've continued to form a cert of sorts over the past 18 months, but we haven't minuted it in the same way. It has transitioned to a bit of BAU, and have we become too complacent in our communication and consultation? It's something for us to continue to pause and reflect on. We've had a number of debrief sessions over the past 18 months, but we still are in pandemic response. So I do question, when is the right time to cease a CERT meeting and pause to do your final debrief. So, there are other elements that I would like to highlight as part of those learnings, and I think it would be fair and reasonable, given the mega trend element that we experience, to focus on the mental health impact of those overlapping and multiple crises, and how you actually support your team. I certainly learnt that I had to step up, and you look, the training exercise was one thing, but phew, jeepers, when I when I attended that training team, that session, I don't think I could have foreseen that there were so many things that I would have had to manage in a short space of time, all in the one day. I led most CERT team discussions, and this did allow my dean to take a step back and take that helicopter view as a senior decision maker. And he and I both have reflected and agreed this worked very well in practice. In his words, no one person can carry all the baggage. And I really like that view. And so, because of that mega trend of CERT meetings and crisis, we didn't always do a great job of debriefing and carrying our learning from one incident to the next. And that was probably because we just didn't have the time. We should pause to ask more questions of those in the room, and who else we hadn't considered. And I've reflected on that communication matter, about being clear about who's making the decisions, and are our decisions and our communication jargon free and personable. We'd had some people in the room who'd never been to a search training. They're not part of the CERT team, but they came in as subject matter experts. So I've acknowledged that we need to spend some more time talking up front about the process and why everyone was here and what was going to happen. And so that BAU matter, I think, is really critical. At what point do you stop those CERT meetings and just it becomes part of your normal operating rhythm? I've reflected that we lacked any psychological first aid skills in terms of guidance and preparation before launching into the problem that needed to be solved. It's almost like this needs to be part of a meeting preamble and discussed as part of the debrief too, before the participants have left the room. There's no harm in taking those last 5 minutes of any meeting to sit back and ask the question: how did we go today? What sort of support do we need to be able to manage this crisis? And who is caring for the carers? I recognise the mental health impact and the cortisol drain of having so many high pressure meetings and crisis management talks within such a short space of time. And we do need to get better at recognising this and caring for those impacted. Interestingly, we've yet to undergo another trial run at forming a CERT team and dealing with the crisis. I'd be interested to see how we went if we had to do this from home rather than on site, because in the office we've got the crisis management bucket and all the materials in there, and we know which room we've got to go to. So it'll be an interesting exercise. So, in closing, I'd like to think this conversation has allowed you to reflect on your own current, past, or future participation in CERT meetings, the influence you might have to make it a richer experience and a more impactful one for those who are the recipients of your decision making, and how you can use this framework into other decision making processes that you're involved in. I'll leave you with a final slide of my contact details, and I wish you all the best in responding to your next crisis. I have an on demand session I recorded earlier, which, although the video runs for 23 minutes, so sorry about that, it's worth a review if you're looking to gain some new insights into leadership in times of crisis. Head over to the main menu, click on demand, and search for crisis in the search field or my name. I want to thank you for choosing my session today, and I'll now hand over to Kathy, our chair, for any questions.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for a really great and informative presentation. And I know that if I'm ever required to manage a crisis, you're the first person that I'm going to call for expert advice, because it sounds like that, it's really interesting to reflect on how 2020 started for you. So thanks, everybody, for your questions. Fiona, we've probably got 3 questions that we might be able to get through before we end. So the first one, which I think is a really important one, is how did you and others keep up your energy levels, and do you have any tips on what works?
Good question. How do we keep up our energy levels? I think with a really strong focus on being positive and truthful. Um, and whilst there was a sense of energy, I didn't feel panic. Um, I can't say that we used jelly beans or any other kind of sugar to really keep everyone together. But I think we were really respectful around everybody's role in the room at the time, and my colleague Julie did a great job of taking fantastic notes and getting those out to all of the people involved quickly, which I think was a really helpful way of keeping everybody engaged and motivated, and recognition of the impact that it had on those who were in the room, who were managing their normal role and their way their what they had to do to respond to this crisis, but also how what their role was in the decision making process too.
And another great question is around how did the faculty's CERT team work and interact with your broader community university teams and comms? Like, was there any inconsistencies or duplications?
I don't think that there was any major challenges between what the university was doing and what we were doing. There was great connection between Monash's main framework and the local level, and we certainly had great templates that the university provided around business continuity and recovery, minute taking. We were involved in business continuity meetings at a senior level. The Dean and I were attending crisis meetings at a senior level and relaying information down through the appropriate channels. So I think the connective points there worked really well. We were very lucky that that streamlined worked. But I think when the rubber hits the road at the local level, that's where I think there's not as much practice and at having to go through this. And it was just having three at the same time that it really highlighted for me the skills that are needed, um, how we manage that internally, and making sure that we still had great linkages back up to central areas on what was our response and our impact, and certainly having a campus that wasn't under the main carriage of the university provided its own challenges, because we had third-party leasing agents we needed to talk to there, and these were students who were working on a trimester model. So they started class in the first week of January, whereas the rest of the campus sort of slowed and stopped on that second day of delivery for the semester model in the semester 2 period. So there's nothing ultimately broken between the connectivity. I'd definitely describe it as that.
Thank you. And probably we've just got time for a final question, which I think is a really great one. Could you recommend a consultancy or emergency response team to help work through some desktop training scenarios?
Oh, that's a good question. The scenarios that were are deployed within Monash are actually run internally. So I haven't got a consultant that I would recommend off the top of my head. But perhaps if there's anyone online in the forum who's uses a consultant or is aware, particularly any of our TEFMA colleagues, have got a consultant that they'd be happy to share amongst the community, I'd be delighted. So I haven't got access to that information, but I think anything that we can pull in to give us new and unique perspectives is really important, and to share those learnings, because I'm sure many of you, particularly our New Zealand colleagues who've gone through the crisis management response to earthquakes, you're all really experienced and well versed at how to manage those. So how do we leverage those learnings within our wider university sector community? Well, it would be great to see any recommendations from others. Oh, there we go. Someone suggested Risk Logic. Thanks, Christy.
We do have another question here from Matthew. So I'm just going to read it out. So what is the cutoff in terms of high impact events that you would train for? Nobody in Australia saw COVID coming at a national level. The assumption was influenza at its worst case, and in East Asia, they had gone through SARS. I was in Hong Kong when it hit. How far should we go? Example, outbreak of war with China, or is that too far out there to plan for?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm not a crisis management expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I think in running a crisis response, I think it serves us well to be looking at small impact plus large impact events is really important, because I had a bit of a giggle when we got the TB outbreak as an example in our training, and I thought, well, this is crazy. Why on earth would we deal with this? Little did I know how similar the TB outbreak example was to really what was happening with COVID, where we moved everything to home and we shut down, and well, you all know the drill. So I don't think it's necessarily bad looking at those large scale ones. But I think we can't underestimate the impact of the small ones. Having to shut down a whole building and move 600 student classes with very short notice because of an air conditioning breakdown in the middle of a week of a heat wave, it is relatively small scale when you think about the whole university. But for us, it was immediate, and it happened very close to the time when we had to get all of our mooting students back home from offshore and everything else. So I would still advocate for small issues right through to the big ones, and everything in between.
Okay, I think that's probably our time. So thank you so much, Fiona, for your presentation today. And thank you, everybody, for participating and your great feedback. Make sure you complete the survey on your exit of the session, and enjoy the rest of your conference and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.